Déclaration de...
Statements by ministers.
The Honourable Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. On this day, 32 years ago, an unspeakable tragedy shook Canada to its core. A gunman walked into a classroom at Polytechnique de Montréal, separated the women from the men, then opened fire on the women. 14 women were murdered, 13 more wounded, and many communities shattered. Aujourd'hui, nous nous souvenons.
Today, we remember Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan,
Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Degnon, Anne-Marie Edouard, Maude Havignac, Maryse Layanière, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Honor, Annie Turcotte, et Barbara Kluznik-Budajewicz. My heart goes out to the families and friends that lost a loved one on December 6th, to those who were wounded, and to all those whose lives were turned upside down by this tragedy. Aujourd'hui et tous les jours.
Today and always, we honor the incredible courage of the survivors who found the strength to carry on.
All Canadians deserve to feel safe in their communities, but gun violence is on the rise in Canada's largest cities. We've taken strong action on gun control, but we recognize that there is still much work to do. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, no one should face violence because of who they are. Yet, this is the terrifying reality for far too many women, youth, and people of all gender identities and expressions.
I stand in solidarity with all survivors and families of those impacted by gender-based violence. As we reflect on the ongoing impact of gender-based violence, I want to acknowledge that some communities are impacted more than others, Mr. Speaker. I think of women and girls, notably women and girls who are Indigenous, Black, racialized, newcomers, women and girls living in northern, rural, and remote communities, women with disabilities, seniors, LGBTQ2 people. The devastating impact of gender-based violence expands beyond those who directly experience it. Violence has long-lasting health, social, and economic effects that can span across generations. This creates cycles of violence within families and sometimes among communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the inequities in society and the urgency for a national action plan to end gender-based violence. I want to inform Canadians that we are on track to getting it done. We have heard from survivors, advocates, experts across the country that we need to do more. That's why we swiftly supported Canadian organizations providing life-saving services for anyone experiencing violence during the pandemic. Our government committed to $300 million in funding to more than 1,200 organizations. This has meant, Mr. Speaker, that 1.3 million women, mothers, and young children had a safer place to turn to. We supported women's shelters, Indigenous off-reserve shelters, sexual assault centers, women's organizations, and other organizations providing supports and services to those experiencing gender-based violence. And we are committed to doing more. In the past few weeks, I have met with gender-based violence and equality-seeking organizations in Halifax, in Toronto, in Ottawa, and more. I have listened to them. I've listened to the needs of partners right across the country, and I am determined to continue supporting survivors. These organizations have worked tirelessly to serve women and families in city centers, in rural and remote areas throughout the harshest months of this pandemic. They didn't get a break. They rolled up their sleeves, put their masks on, and they got straight to work. I assured them, and I assure all of you here today, that our government will be by their side. We will make sure they have the necessary resources to sustain strong, viable, and inclusive services for survivors. Our work does not stop here. After all, it's on all of us to be part of the solution, because everyone, in fact, has a responsibility to stand against misogyny, sexism, and hate. As my honorable colleagues know, we are nearing the end of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which runs until Human Rights Day, which is on December 10th. This year's theme, 16 Days and Beyond, challenges every single person in Canada to step up, to speak out, and take action against acts of gender-based violence, not just during the 16 days of activism, but each and every day. Gender equality benefits all of us, and everyone has an important role to play in advancing it. Across Canada, there are thousands of men and boys joining the causes for gender equality, and we must continue to grow their ranks by calling men in to the movement and by having these important conversations with our sons. Men and boys are an important part of this conversation, not just as allies in the struggles for gender equality, but because they too are impacted by gender-based violence. We need positive role models to ensure a culture of respect, a culture that values every individual and every community. The 14 young women who died at École Polytechnique 32 years ago will always be in our thoughts, always in our hearts. They will live on as a constant reminder of what misogyny and hate can do. Mr. Speaker, everyone has the right to live free from violence, and we will continue to work with Canadians to end it in all its forms. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
L'honorable député de Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis. Dear colleagues, Mr. Speaker, on December 6th, 1989, 14 women were murdered in an act of terror at the École Polytechnique in Montreal just because they were women. I'm talking about Geneviève Bergeron, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Barbara Klusnik-Vidajewicz, Hélène Colgan, Maryse Leclerc, Maryse Lagagnère, Maude Havernick, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud, and Annie Turcotte. I can't help but think about all the violence and horror that these women went through. We must remember.
Their 20s had their whole lives ahead of them, but hatred and misogyny shattered their dreams and stole their lives. On this day, we remember those women. We also commemorate women in Canada and around the world who have been victims of hate and violence in all its forms, domestic violence, harassment, and sexual assault. Ce 6 décembre 1989, la tuerie de Polytechnique a...
The Polytechnique massacre shook the entire country and wounded it deeply. That day, Canadians realized that gender equality was still far away. This tragic event showed us to what an extent progress and advance can be fragile. We must continue waging the struggle every day, and we must do so on behalf of the victims, their families, their colleagues, as well as all of the women who are still victims of violence. We still remember the victims of the Polytechnique massacre. It is a living memory in the person of young women who aren't afraid of bringing their dreams to reality and continuing to overcome obstacles every day. The memory of these victims live on in women who continue to graduate and take on professional careers, engineering careers, and so on. Their memory also lives on among the women here in this house today. women who have decided to go into politics in order to protect the most vulnerable, in order to support just causes. It lives on among Indigenous women who are not afraid to criticize racism and prejudice and who are working hard to build safe communities. Mr. Speaker, their memory lives on among those who are victim supporters. And their memory lives on among their parents, their family, their colleagues, and all of the activists who fight every day for a more egalitarian society. And their memory lives on in the Parliament of Ottawa, here in Ottawa. For the last 2 years, we have been faced with an unprecedented health crisis. In many families, the pandemic has made mental health worse. We must be there to support victims. We must also continue fighting the shadow pandemic. This shadow pandemic is the pandemic of the increase in violence against women and killings of women throughout the country. Women continue to be assaulted every day. This spring, the member for Lévis-Lobinière and Senator Boisvenu tabled a bill in order to better react in cases where men are accused of domestic violence. All of this counts in making our society more respectful, fair, and human.
Victims of the Polytechnique massacre is a reminder that we must not give up. 32 years ago, 14 women were murdered because they were women. But on this dark day, let us continue this fight in their names. We must unite, act, and replace words in action. Together, let's put an end to misogyny. Together, let's ensure that no one else is left in distress. And together, let us ensure that violence against women is never again tolerated, whether it's online, in schools, or in the workplace. Il est temps de mettre les victimes au centre de nos préoccupations.
It is time that we place victims at the very center of our concerns. Too many tragedies, too much violence. We must put an end to it. Today, Canadians and Quebecers will remember the victims of the Polytechnique massacre. This type of tragedy must never occur again. We owe it to the victims. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I would like to celebrate the termination of a young woman, Willow Dew, a student at the University of Alberta. She was decorated with the Order of the White Rose in memory of the Polytechnique victims. It is an order that is given to a Canadian female engineering student who plans to continue studying at the post-bachelor level. Like her mother before her, she has shown that women can make their dreams a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Shefford.
The honourable member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, what must be going on in the head of a man when he takes out a gun to kill a woman just because she's a woman? What must be going on in his head when he orders these young female strangers to line up against the wall just because they're women? For 32 years, we've been wondering what the answers to those questions are. The same questions and the same lack of answers. And the questions are just piling up. What must be happening today in the head of a man when he clenches his hands around the neck of a woman that he once loved? What must be going on in his head? How can he kill a woman? I don't understand. I can't understand what's going on in the minds of these men when we see in the news that there have been 18 murders of women in 2021. When a man sees that news, does he feel the same fear, shame, and anger as I do, as we do? Do these men also want to scream, cry, throw up? I believe that they do feel those things. I don't understand what has happened. The 14 women killed in 1989 at the École Polytechnique by a man, and 18 women killed by men in 2021. Things are getting better. Or are they? Does anyone think that they're really getting better? What lessons have we drawn from the École Polytechnique massacre? What have we learned? Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Maude Aviernik, Barbara Kruznik-Vidajewicz, Maryse Lagagnère, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud, Annie Turcotte. How many times must we name you before things change? Because things are not changing. The deaths, the candlelight vigils, the commemorations keep going on. These lists of victims keep growing. Marley, Nancy, Myriam, Caroline, Nadège, Rebecca, Cataluc, Diane, Zuleika, Lisette, Nathalie, Elle, Andréane, Anna, Roman, and Elle, once again. Each of these names represents a tragedy. Each of these names reminds us of the sorrow and pain felt, and reminds us of our responsibility. When someone does things just once, well, it's about individual responsibility. We don't have to take on the burden of every individual tragedy, something that only happens once. But when something happens over and over and over, once, twice, 10 times, 18 times, and when the number keeps climbing, and we just have to keep waiting for the next time that it will tick upwards inexorably, every year, relentlessly, well then, the responsibility for those hundreds and thousands of individual actions is no longer an individual responsibility. It represents a collective responsibility. We owe something to these women. We bear a burden of debt, and we must remember that every December 6th. We are collectively responsible. In this parliament, each and every one of us is individually responsible. We are responsible for taking action because we can. Not many people have that power, but we do. We have that power. I'm not some Pollyanna. I'm not saying that if this House takes action, there will be no more gender-based violence. I'm not that naive. But if we reduce access to weapons, if we better protect victims from their abusers, if we take women's condition in the army more seriously, as well as the situation of Indigenous women, if we buckle down, perhaps we will be able to save 1, 2, 10, or 18 women. Maybe not, but at least we would have really tried. I don't know what's going on in the mind of a man who takes out his gun to kill a woman just because she's a woman. But I know that we must limit access to weapons. I don't know what's going on in the mind of a violent man, but I know that we must do everything we can to make sure that if a woman feels threatened by him, we keep her safe. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that outside these doors, millions of men are reading the newspapers or watching TV and are feeling ashamed of these numbers, and that they're feeling afraid, knowing that other men are killing and hurting women just because they're women. I know that there are men out there who want to scream and yell and cry because of what's happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. I know that they're afraid for all women. Together, women and men, on behalf of the victims of Polytechnique and those who have died since, we must act. We can do it, and we must. Let us act. To the victims of Polytechnique, I say, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, and I believe on behalf of all parliamentarians in this House, we will not forget. We will not forget our debt and our responsibility to you. Let us act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Monsieur le Président, cela...
Mr. Speaker, it's been 32 years now since killing of women. 14 women were killed and 14 women were injured in the École Polytechnique massacre. The tragedy left communities, families, and friends in a state of profound sadness for the loss of loved ones because of this act of senseless violence.
Crime attacked the fundamental rights of women and girls everywhere, including our right to security, equality, and education, and shook Canada's conscience to the core. It was a day of reckoning, forcing the country to accept this crisis of violence that women are faced with far too often, absent of supports that have resulted from generations of systems that have chosen to turn a blind eye to this violence, a crisis of violence that continues to be perpetuated. As we gather here today, Mr. Speaker, to mourn the massacre at École Polytechnique, the crisis of violence against women and diverse gendered peoples continues. In 2020 alone, 160 women were murdered, which means that a woman is killed every other day on average, and girls younger than 11 years old experience the highest rate of homicides. Tragically, Mr. Speaker, rates of violence have increased even more since the pandemic, 400 times higher in some areas. Inaction costs lives. Almost 50% of femicides are committed by an intimate partner, and women are 5 times more likely to be killed by their intimate partner. And this experience of violence impacts all age groups, including half of all women who experience at least one incident of gender-based violence before the age of 16. 30% of women 15 or older who report experiencing a sexual assault at least once. And the over 6,000 women
6,000 women, Mr. Speaker, and children who sleep in shelters on any given night because it is not safe at home. And this epidemic of violence is even more pronounced when viewed through an intersectional lens, Mr. Speaker. Women with a disability are 3 times more likely to experience violent victimization compared to women living without a disability. Trans individuals are more likely to have experienced violence by the age of 15, and also more likely to experience inappropriate behaviors in public, online, and at work than cisgender individuals. And Indigenous women, Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women are killed 7 times the rate of that of non-Indigenous women. A recognized genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit that has become so normalized. Normalized, Mr. Speaker, that in this country, that when a young Gitxsan woman's door was violently torn down by the RCMP using an axe and a chainsaw, an axe and a chainsaw, it barely made the news. So today I wish to honor all the women who lost their lives at École Polytechnique by calling on all members of this House to stop talking and immediately act. Gender equality is a human right, and failing to protect this fundamental right results in the loss of life, precious lives. Our sisters, our mothers, aunties, our grandmothers, our daughters. Aux familles de celles et ceux
to the families of those who lost a loved one due to this tragic massacre, my colleagues in the NDP and I honor you today and every day. Geneviève Bergeron,
Coljean, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Denio, Anne-Marie Edouard, Maude Aviernic, Maurice Laganière, Maurice Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelche, Michel Richard, Anne St. Arnaud, Annie Turcotte, Barbara Kluznik-Vadajevich. Enough is enough. We remember you. We will remember you through our action. May you feel for all eternity the warm embrace of your ancestors. You are loved.